of evangelism. But as we start, I just want to know, Terry, are you doing okay? You all right? Everything good?
Oh, I'm okay. How about you, buddy? Are you doing all right?
All in all, I think I'm starting to, focus more on all of the great opportunities that all of this social upheaval is providing for us. And there's a lot of changes, and a lot of them are uncomfortable. But within each of them is the possibility for something pretty amazing. I will freely admit, though, that finding them sometimes feels like you're selling all you have to find that pearl of great price. But I think the process is going to be worth it for a lot of people in the end. I have a number of friends who have seen great benefit in this particular year that didn't think this year was going to amount to much for them at all. New jobs, new family opportunities, new opportunities to serve, etc. So before we get to more serious things, we do have a serious, topic. I didn't even show Terry the outline before we went live, but I
Which
think
is
you'll
funny because
recognize
it
it.
was my idea.
Yeah, um, it'll be
True
fun.
collaboration and planning, by the way. Unlike our series, our show on planning that was planned 5 minutes before we started, this one was planned about 36 hours. So we're improving on our planning.
Absolutely, we planned well. Um, So here's a simple question for you, Terry. We had lots of complicated ones at different times, and I was getting a little too esoteric with my question design process, which Terry still probably hasn't figured out how to spell it to Google it yet. Um, but here's the simple thing.
Oh, intended only to be understood by a small number of people. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Here you go. Word for the day.
Yeah,
Yay!
word of the day. Tomorrow's word for the day is Poughkeepsius. Good morning, Hal. How are you doing? Um,
Poughkeepsie. What did you say?
Poughkeepsius. Do you
Next
want the
question.
definition?
No, next question.
Simple. Favorite soda.
Ooh, ooh.
Very simple.
There's two. There's two.
How
And
Kentucky are you? How Tennessee are you? That's going to
I am
judge.
not Kentucky at all, dude.
And
Actually, there's
you
probably.
got some roots. You got some roots that go up there. Um,
Oh, I don't really. I mean,
yeah.
yeah, parents are both from there, but yeah.
Okay.
Actually, my mom's from Indiana. So I guess if I was really Kentucky, I would say something like Ale 8,
Correct. That would be the standard
or
answer.
or the other Kentucky drink, by the way, is Big Red.
Hmm.
Okay, those are the two Kentucky drinks. I have always been a Mountain Dew guy,
Hmm.
and next to Mountain Dew is Dr Pepper. And when they came out with Diet Dr Pepper, and like most people, I thought I had to drink diet drinks all the time. That's what I went with because it was the most regular tasting of all the diet drinks. But they came out with a drink called Mountain Dew Zero in the last 6 months, and it's hard to find now because they didn't keep it full production. But man, it is like the original Mountain Dew. But if I can find the one time I go outside of the diet is when I can find the Mountain Dew original that they bottle in the glass bottles with the pure sugar in it.
Yeah.
That takes me home to college days. It was nothing for me to go through a case of Mountain Dew a week, like nothing. Sometimes two. So Mountain Dew is pretty much the all-time classic.
Yeah. College Phil existed and subsisted on excessive amounts of Mountain Dew, probably dangerous levels of Mountain Dew.
Yeah, me too.
Though in time, for me, Dr. Pepper really is the key beverage of choice. If I'm going to have a sugared soda and I get to pick, that's it.
I
And it
also
will,
like Orange Crush, by the way. That's the
well,
UT
yeah.
fan in me. There's nothing like a big bottle of Orange Crush.
Um,
So,
I do have one exception if I'm going to be, and this is if I'm at the pharmacy in just outside of Nashville, I will get their orange soda. Their orange cream soda is my,
by the way, I'm not a fan of places. I remember going to Torchy's, great tacos. I'm not a fan of places that make their own soda. That usually pushes me towards the tea. And
yeah,
I'm not a Pepsi guy, by the way. I don't like Pepsi at all, but I like Mountain Dew. But if you're gonna give me a regular old what we call Coke, it's got to be Coke, man. It can't be
yeah.
Pepsi.
Michael's calling back the memory. My mom is a traditional Coca-Cola drinker. And when they went to the new Coke formula, my mom went out and like hoarded all of it. And literally, I think she would have punched us in the face if we took any of her Coca-Cola at that point.
One of the worst business decisions in the history of the planet, by the way, was New Coke. From a marketing, it's a fascinating, by the way, for those people who've not looked into that, it's a fascinating study in marketing, public relations, and business to look at the Coke wars and what Coke did. The dumbest thing they could have ever done, really and truthfully.
Well,
They were powerful enough to recover with the classic, but it was ridiculously stupid.
yeah. So Terry, we're right past the top of the hour. I know that you had the genesis for conversation today. I did go and listen to the podcast you mentioned. That's kind of where the outline for this, kind of comes from. I've had Moxie, I've had Surge, I've had a lot of different things back in the cycling through all the specialty
do you remember
brands.
Nitro Cola? Nitro Cola, man. If you wanted to stay up all night, get you 2 Nitro Colas. It would set you free. It's yeah.
But why don't you walk us into our topic for today and kind of set the stage for what we've got on the table?
Well, we want to talk about criticism of the church, and I'll be honest with you. One of the reasons I think that's important to talk about right now is because in my lifetime, I have not seen perhaps more difficulty navigating this kind of area than we see right now. And this idea came from a Rainer on Leadership podcast, so there'll be some similarities if any of our guys listen to that. And by the way, if you don't listen to Rainer on Leadership, I kind of suggest you do that. But Tom and Sam Rainer talked about this, and Tom Rainer calls what's going on now the quarantine quarreling. There's just a lot of that, and one of the things that's happened, regardless of who I talk to, Phil, you and I have talked about this, and everybody I've talked to about this. One of the things that's happened with all of this COVID stuff is regardless of what you're doing, somebody is complaining and criticizing the leadership for what decisions have been made. And it's really a difficult thing right now. It's I'll just be honest to people who aren't in that kind of area of leadership. It's probably, as you said, there are some positive things that have come out of all this, but the criticism and the fighting is probably one of the most discouraging things I've had to endure in the past 6 months. Because it doesn't matter what you do, somebody has a problem with it. And you're not going to make everybody happy. So it's really good to talk about how we handle that, how we deal with that. But what we're going to talk about today really applies, Phil, to everything. And here's the key. If you're going to be an elder, if you're going to be a deacon, if you're going to be a Bible class teacher, if you're going to be a preacher, you're going to be in any kind of active role of leadership, you are absolutely going to receive criticism. It's going to be a part of your life. You're going to have a little thick skin in order to fulfill any of those roles, because you're placing yourself into a role where you're going to be judged. And I mean, to a degree, when we studied James, we talked about the context, but I do think there's a little bit of an application that when you are a teacher, you do get stricter judgment than anybody else. When you put yourself in these kind of roles from people, you kind of get judgment that other people don't get. So how do we handle that? How do we view that? How do we process that? Those are all important things, and hopefully we'll have some good discussion from our listeners as well.
So I took time to kind of listen to that podcast Harry had mentioned, dug through some of my own stuff that I use when I have to serve into a role as a moderator, mediator. Sometimes I've done that, for families or for brethren. And Rainer had 4 or 5 steps. I think the 5th one, where he talks about prayer, for our purposes, it's all part of the process. But the first part of the thing that I tend to do in those settings is really try to figure out through conversation, through any method that we have on the table, is to try to get down to the actual issue. And for me, I'll set some guidelines on how those conversations are going to go. And so on the front part of the table, before we sit down and have any kind of in-person thing, every participant needs to sign on to some ideas. Things like, if I'm leading the circumstances, whether it's a moderation or just a a one-on-one conversation between two individuals that they've asked me to be that third party for, do I have the right to interrupt? Like, I ask that ahead of time. Can I interrupt when I need to? Sometimes you're not allowed to interrupt someone, but in these kind of conversations, you've got to do that. And, there are some other things that have to go in place there that, that has to be respected and not overused and all of those things. But that's like one of the first things that's going to be necessary, because my interruptions tend to be, can you say that again so that I can understand you better? Is there another way you can explain this so that we can have a better perception of both what you're saying and what kind of emotions you're trying to convey to us? It's a really easy thing for me to read whatever I write and know exactly what I meant. It's a much harder thing to take how I feel and what I believe and what I think, put it on a page and have anyone else read it and understand what I feel or what I think. And that gets magnified when there is multiple levels of pain or difficulty involved. And so really that discern part really is, let's take some time and to ask good questions, dig into the setting and the situation a little bit to get an understanding of what's going on, get a lay of the land.
Discerning too for me, this first phase is trying to decide the legitimacy of what's going on. And let me say this. Rayner made this point. Sam Rayner did, and I thought it was really good. Sometimes critics are critical of you, and really that's just an outlet for them for some other form of anger going on in their life that they can't deal with. A lot of times, critics are hurting people who hurt other people, is what they are. And so sometimes what you have to do is to discern, is this just somebody that's hurting and this is the way that's manifested and coming out? And in that case, Phil, when you respond to that, what you do is you really respond to that with really and truthfully love and giving them attention, and allowing them to vent, but also doing that in a way that's healthy for them. And you realize that that's what's going on. And sometimes that happens. I remember several years ago, we were doing something for married couples, and there was a marriage I knew was in trouble. And they were mad about what we were doing for married couples because it wasn't enough. Now, it was more than we were doing before. But the complaint was, well, they think that's going to do any good. And so we had a conversation about, and let them vent. But again, here was a move to do something when we were doing nothing. But it still wasn't going to be enough because the real problem was what their own issue was. And so sometimes you have to discern that. And sometimes you discern that this is a really legitimate complaint. Now, what you said about interrupting to get clarification is really important. Let me say this to people who may complain. Don't let your presentation of your criticism cause so much conflict that you can't be heard. And at the same time, those of us who are listening need to try to, as much as possible, ignore the tone and tenor of the presentation to listen to what's being said. Because here's what happens, Phil. You've probably been there. I know I have. And by the way, I've not always done this well. This has caused me at times some real problems. And this is why, this podcast was something I really was drawn to. If somebody is really aggressive in their complaint and really aggressive in their tone, my first reaction, and I think most people's first reaction, is to kind of recoil in a defensive manner and want to lash back more at the tone and the aggressive nature of the presentation than the actual complaint that's being shared. And so part of your discernment is trying to look past how it's being presented and actually think through what is being presented to see if it's a legitimate complaint. Because, Phil, you know this, especially as a shepherd now, if it's a legitimate complaint, it deserves to be dealt with. It needs to be dealt with. And regardless of how it's presented, if there's legitimacy to it, then it's of value. And it should be seen as a help to you, that there's a legitimate concern that you should deal with.
Yeah, and here's a way to think about it. The New Testament text gives us a specific illustration of this process. Do not receive an accusation against an elder unless. And so in that unless context, there is a need for verification that this is a legitimate thing. I want to make a quick little side point. Even if an accusation is made against an eldership or an elder, in absence of these verifiable witnesses, it doesn't mean there's not value in going through the process of thinking through, okay, even if this is not true, is it something that's worth taking the time to make sure never happens in the future? Like, it could be a false accusation, but we don't want it to happen in the future. So how do we approach that?
Yeah.
Secondly, is the issue that's being raised or a different one? Is this an illegitimate issue, but it's the smokescreen for the legitimate one? And so we need to figure that out. Then if it actually is legitimate, all right, you deal with it. And one of the things that I think is vital in that process, and it's hard, it's difficult to process, is to accept that you or I may actually be the problem. Not as a whole thing, but really
I might be doing it.
Yeah, at least part of
the problem. Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe I am unnecessarily sensitive to something. Maybe I'm not willing to let go. Maybe I said something without forethought or foresight. Maybe I didn't foresee a need as a leader or as part of a leadership team, and now we've got a problem because of it. All of those things are legitimate aspects of the leadership part of the table, but they're also part of the aspect of the other parts of the conversation too. And so when you get there, deal with it. Like, directly go in there and say, we're going to fix this the way that God wants us to fix that.
And the best biblical example of that, Phil, is Acts 6, where there's this complaint about how the Greek widows are being handled. And rather than the apostles going, hey, y'all can't complain about us or something along those lines, they go, okay, this is a legitimate complaint. Here's a solution. Let's deal with it and then move on. So that's I think, an important point to all of that. You look frozen, or am I frozen? So as we consider that, we'll just have to keep going in case it's Phil that's frozen and not me. Again, what you see with Acts 6 is that there is a legitimate complaint here, and when that legitimate complaint is brought up, we have to deal with that. And so that's important for us to consider from that standpoint. And I think one of the things to do through all of that is, again, just to think about, regardless of whether or not this concern is legitimate or presented in the proper way, that we need to continue on and make sure we deal with it in a legitimate kind of way and make sure that we handle that. Now, as we continue thinking about that, and hopefully Phil can hop back in with us here in a moment, one of the things you've got to do when you go through this process and when it becomes this discernment, there's also this question. What happens when you go through the process and you find out that this isn't a legitimate concern, or maybe beyond that, even if it is a legitimate concern, how do you handle it when somebody just misbehaves? And maybe one of the things they do is maybe throw a temper tantrum. Maybe they just throw a really, really bad fit. Whatever it is, how do you respond to that? What do you do with that? Let me say this. I think one of the great things that you have to do is you cannot feed the problem by continuing to placate somebody who is behaving badly. And so you have to balance that discernment with legitimacy, with also not making it so that somebody is continuously allowed to run things because of their poor behavior. So I think that's a very, very difficult kind of thing. So one of the things I need to kind of share with you is Phil's power is out, so we may be flying solo, and I'll be going by myself there. couple of comments before we move on. Michael Walls, good buddy there, says due diligence is a definite requirement. We need to always ask if the criticism is valid. And that, again, is what we've been saying. Shane Scott says if 7 Habits, Covey talks about listening for whether the person you are communicating with is speaking more logically or more emotionally. If emotionally, stop trying to use reason and instead of use empathy. I have found that very helpful. That is a great point. That really gets to the heart of a lot of what we're talking about is that if somebody is just being emotional in this process and that's all they're doing, then logic is not going to set in. I think we've all been in those situations where we get so emotional we become irrational. And so in those cases, what you really need to do, what that person needs more than anything else, is to know that you love them, to show that empathy, and to be a good part of the person that is comforting them in that situation. So great share there with Shane. Looks like Phil's trying to get back on. One of the things that comes up is that how do you disrupt this process? How do you disrupt the complaint? How do you disrupt the complaining and the criticism? And how do you do that? In a couple of ways. As I was saying earlier, one of the ways you may do that is just to walk away. You may just need to walk away from the situation. If somebody is really, really complaining, but they're just throwing a temper tantrum, you may need sometimes, and we do this with our kids, to kind of walk away for a while. In fact, I help, I'm a manager for my daughter's soccer team, which means I work with the coach directly. One of the things that's always interesting about that is we have a rule in soccer teams, and most sports have this, that you have to wait 24 hours before you're allowed to contact the coach with a complaint. So let me say that to members complaining. Before you fire off that email or make that phone call, give yourself a day. Give yourself a day to think through. Give yourself a day to consider whether your complaint is legitimate. Give yourself a day to pray before you make that complaint. But to those of us who may receive the complaints, sometimes what we need to do is give ourselves a day to kind of process what's going on and to figure out. You do not have to respond immediately. In fact, I can tell you from my standpoint, when I make the biggest mistakes is when I fire that email off too quickly. That's when I really make huge mistakes. Is when I get a complaint, an email, and I go, oh yeah, well, and I send that off. That's when things go pretty south because I'm not acting rationally. I'm being emotional at that point as well. So sometimes you need to walk away. Phil's back. Good to see you. He walked away for a while because this was too emotional for him, but he's back with us. Sometimes you need to walk away, and then at some point, and Michael Wall says this, when there's criticism or complaining, teaching needs to happen, and that is true. Look for the teaching moment and all of that and a way to take care of all of those things. But then the question becomes, Phil, we're kind of on the disruption phase. Do you ever directly confront the critic? We've talked about the fact that if you're receiving legitimate criticism, then you'd handle that. And maybe that means you change. Maybe that means you sit down with somebody else and show them where they need to change. Maybe that means that we all need to sit down together. But what about the constant critic who's just behaving badly, and for whatever reason, while they're behaving badly, their complaint is not really legitimate, or even if it is, their behavior has become a greater problem than the complaint, which also is potential. When do you actually confront them? I have some ideas about that, but Phil, I'll let you come in since I've had to carry everything for the last 8 minutes.
It happens every once in a while. There's a shared responsibility and obligation. Here's a couple things to think about, at least off the top of my head for me, in regards to like when do these things need to be dealt with. And here's some of it can be dealt with on the front end. One of the things I was going to bring up, actually right when the power decided to go out, maybe it'll happen again, we'll see, is use this illustration. You're in the process of looking to appoint new shepherds in a congregation, new deacons in a congregation, and you decide to employ anonymous processes where people can send in complaints or criticisms, but they don't sign their names to them. They don't assign their own actions to them. You're actually creating a problem with that because you're enabling, in essence, gossip. You're saying it's totally okay to talk about someone behind their back and create conflict. So you can fix and interrupt that process on the front end. Right from the get-go, you can interrupt it, you can fix it, and step in. On the other side, when you're kind of working through it on another edge or another portion of it, you might decide to step in and directly address it in this way. Sometimes someone needs to be told, hey, this is not an appropriate behavior. We do it with our children. No, you don't get to throw a temper tantrum. You just don't get to. Whatever you think is really important isn't that important. And so sometimes that's part of the solution. Next step in that process is to recognize and realize that, hey, maybe there's some other things going on that we need to address right now. And it's that individual's behavior, because their issue might be real, but how they've now magnified it. And in the context of us working through, and Terry brought this up earlier, just the protocols for congregations to assemble in reflection to the local community and state and national rules, there's going to be some conflict and there's going to be some challenge there. And so in that process, you're going to have to figure out, how do we negotiate that while everybody's upset and uncomfortable and being pushed out of their comfort zones.
And I think you brought up, again, the bad behavior kind of idea, and sometimes that's worse than the complaint. There's times as a dad that I've told my kids, go back and walk back in and talk to me a different way, and we'll consider what you're saying, right? There's times that I tell my kids that. And there's also times I tell my kids, I'm just not going to talk to you right now. You need a timeout to figure out how to calm down. And while you may not say things that way to somebody, to members of the congregation, in theory, the practice is still the same. Sometimes it may be, okay, we need to tone this down, and we need to say this in a calmer way. And sometimes it may be, we're not going to talk about this right now till we get some cooler heads, all of us, from that standpoint. If you ask me, I think there's 2 times that I think I have to directly confront the critic, Phil, for me. One of those is when they are starting to cause division within the congregation. I think not only is it wise to address that, it is absolutely necessary that you have to address that. In fact, both of these things I'm going to say in Scripture are actually grounds for church discipline. One of those is causing division within the congregation. The second of those is when it starts to bring shame upon the church itself because of their behavior. I think that's particularly valuable today in the area of social media. Somebody gets online and fires off something about my sermon or me. I may ignore that, by the way. And by the way, it's probably best on social media to ignore as much as possible. That if you've ever been in part of a neighborhood watch page, you know how quickly things spiral out of control. We have a neighborhood watch page where yesterday one lady complained about being in a restaurant and everybody wasn't wearing masks, and that turned into basically a dumpster fire of everybody yelling at her about going out to eat if she thought they should wear masks. And then we had somebody else that at the same day, her daughter got pushed and shoved and cussed out at a gas station because she was wearing a mask. And so you have these 2 sides with these 2 very violent reactions, all part of this quarantine quarreling, by the way, just perfect example. And it goes on social media, and I mean, it's literally, by the time it's over, hundreds of comments about this nonsense. Yeah. But if somebody gets online and social media and starts running down the congregation, that has to be dealt with. That's one of those things where you have to, and not online, that's where you go and talk to them directly and say, look, you cannot do this. This is not godly behavior. And again, both of those things, by the way, both of those things ultimately could end up as grounds for discipline if that behavior does not change. And obviously at that point, the behavior is a bigger problem than the complaint, even if it is legitimate. The behavior becomes a bigger issue at that point. And that's where this becomes a very delicate process to balance all of that.
Right. So again, Michael has kind of talked about his agreement, like about not wanting the anonymous system. I'm going to try to look at it from a different corner. I'm not a fan of not signing your name. If you won't sign your name, then don't submit whatever you're going to say, because on me, on a personal level, I might read it, but I'm not going to give it weight. I might read it to say, hey, is this something I don't know about? Maybe I need to know about this, but there's no substance to it. I'm going to academically just go, yeah, okay, no, I'm not interested. Thank you for your comments. But I might give it some weight. But let's say now we have weight behind it and someone has put their name on it and they've done this, like Terry's brought an illustration from social media. Maybe it's a private conversation, whatever the context, doesn't matter. I've invited that. I've asked for those comments. I've asked for that critique. And so now I've got to approach it and say, how am I going to handle it stepping forward? Well, using our illustration about accusations against elders, I'm going to ask for verification. Say, hey, can you give me some verification about this? If they are unable or unwilling to, then that's the end of it. If I, from a mechanical standpoint, like that's where that has to end. I'm going to say, well, I appreciate your concerns. We're going to take that general idea under advisement, but without any kind of further information, there's nothing we can do about it. And here's why. If the eldership or an elder is actually doing that thing and they're causing that conflict, they need to know who to go to make correction, to offer a chance for biblical reconciliation. They need that, and you want that. If the accusation is true, it needs to be dealt with. If it's untrue, it needs to be dealt with. And then there's another couple aspects of it that are kind of important as well. Treating it that way, giving it that legitimacy, actually improves the next processes, which is, should it happen again, everyone knows how it's going to be handled with them and anybody else. It'll be fair, it'll be impartial, it'll be addressed. It will be handled as a real thing. I say that because in many congregational contexts, there are individuals who feel like they have no voice. And if they feel like they have no voice, and you tell them to go to the elders about a thing or a deacon about a thing, and they do, and you don't do anything, now they feel silenced as opposed to not having a voice. Shay brings up a great point, one that I tend to empathize with in certain levels too. He says, this kind of thing is tough for me because I am such a people pleaser and hate conflict so much. But I've recently come to the realization that if I keep my focus on God bringing good out of the situation, no matter uncomfortable, it takes a little of the people pleaser pressure off. And for sure it does. I think it definitely brings an edge of perspective because there is a big part of me that wants everyone to be in unity and happy. And I'm like, what can I do in service to enable that to happen? And so that's a challenge for all of us. Terry?
Well, I think, I'm a people pleaser too. I think there's a situation where being a people pleaser really, if you're not careful, opens the gate to practicing things in a way that's not scriptural. And one of those ways is, especially for elders, if you're a people pleaser and people come to you complaining about another member and have not practiced Matthew 18, and you're a people pleaser, you're going to jump in and try to please them by dealing with that when what they need to be told is go practice Matthew 18. And one of the things that's important about that is how God brings good out of this situation, right? And I think it's interesting too, you were talking about the legitimacy and if people won't give evidence, one of my favorite kind of things that people say sometimes is, well, some of us have been talking, and then they give you a complaint. And you go, well, who else is talking so they can be a part of this conversation? Well, I don't want to say. Well, already, and this is just the reality for those of you that may use that tactic. I mean, automatically, I'm gonna discredit your complaint a little bit because you refuse to be honest about this way you've shared the complaint. Because that's an issue. If you're coming on behalf of several people, as you said, there may be things I need to go to those people. And by the way, on the other side of Matthew 18 is Matthew 5, that if I know somebody has a problem with me before I worship, I'm supposed to go take care of that as well. But how can I do that if I don't know who that is? I mean, it's very important in this process that we kind of make sure that all of those things, which are godly principles, are actually followed. And to get back to Shane's comment, if I'm such a people pleaser that I'm willing to circumvent that, I'm actually doing a discredit to the entire congregation in the process.
And let me frame my answer to someone who might say, but hey, wait a minute, I was given this information in confidence or whatever. We're dealing with two principles here, honesty and openness, or integrity and openness. We want to be open about things when we are in the position where that's an appropriate thing, but integrity matters too. And so let's say someone does come to you and say, I got this problem, but I don't feel like I can talk to them about it. Your first option is, let's get together with the three of us. Let's all three of us bring this up to the person who you don't feel comfortable with. Or maybe let me shift the table one more degree. And the elders have been grappling, and I'll talk about it from eldership role, because in congregations, if at all possible, elders really, need to be a part of that. You can get criticism, not complaint, but criticism about how a thing is going, whether it's a Bible class, a deacon's work, a preacher's approach to his work, etc. Take it all into consideration. Realize it's not personal. And with integrity, never break the rule of confidential behavior, because you take it on to you. He says, as elders, we believe this is important for us to discuss. And now you've shifted individuals off the table altogether. And you're taking full accountability for what's said after that, because now you kept your integrity. You're not playing this game of dishonesty with some people are saying, because that's essentially dishonesty of a kind.
Well, there's another part of this, by the way, that Matthew 18 has that we overlook. There is a natural filtration process to conflict resolution built into Matthew 18, and this is what it is. If that person is not willing to talk to the person they have a problem with, then it is not a big enough problem to be addressed. And I think that's something we often overlook, is that if you got a problem with somebody, you go talk to them. If you're not willing to do that, what Matthew 18 really means is then you've got to let that go as a problem, because you're not willing to deal with it biblically. If you go to somebody else and you're that person that they come to, as Michael Walls says, your standard answer has to be, no, you go talk to that person. Because there is a natural filtration process about how important the complaint is. If the complainer is not willing to issue the complaint themselves, it is not a legitimate complaint. And I think that we overlook that, and that's a very difficult thing. And it's important to kind of keep all of that in context.
Yeah, and some of the things that kind of come into this process, especially as we scoot into the final considerations of all of this, you've got to come out with a resolution that addresses the actual issues, but provides a platform to move forward in a better place. Because in many of these cases, it could be simplified in another way. Let's say our conflict gets really simplified, and it's as simple as, where are we going to eat dinner tonight? And the factors around that. There's 4 different appetites, 4 different hungers, and we've got to figure out, how do we combine those 2 concepts and then go pick a place to eat. And everyone's going to be disappointed, because all those 4 people aren't going to get their way every time. You've got to figure out how to get to that point. And it's never been solved by someone saying, well, I don't really care. But then they say no to everything afterwards, because they do care. But we haven't developed a way to work through that. And so in directing the next steps and being direct as to the solution, you've got to push to that edge where he says, okay, this is what we're going to do. This is how it's going to be handled. And the handling of it can include discipline. We've talked about that before. A divisive spirit has to be pruned. In the end, the church is actually better after that pruning, even though it hurts every part involved. And I think it's a concept that we struggle with, because many preachers and many elderships derive a perception of their effectiveness based on the size of the church that they preach for. And every time that number goes down, they feel less effective. And every time that number goes up, they feel more effective, when neither of those things are actual true metrics of success.
Yeah, and you said about offering a solution and the idea of what to eat is a great illustration. Matt and Jen Schmidt in their podcast for married couples, I think the way that Jen put it is, in their family they have a saying that says, no rejection without a solution. Like, you're not allowed to say no unless you have some way to solve the no. Otherwise, you're not given that ability. And I think that's a great idea kind of here is, look, the other thing I as a leader that I would often ask somebody is, okay, I hear your criticism. What's your solution? Like, how do you think we should handle that? And that doesn't mean they're going to get their way. I think that's one of the things to kind of keep in mind. Doesn't mean they have the right solution. And look, I think one of the things to keep in mind is There are some things, and especially with what we're dealing with right now, with whatever we decide to do, somebody's going to be upset with the solution. Whether you're meeting inside, outside, both, whether you're offering one assembly or three, whether you're social distancing or not, whether you're wearing masks, whether you're making mask optional or required, doesn't matter what decision you make. There's a segment of your group, for whatever reason it may be, that is going to find that solution unacceptable.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the difficult part of all of this. And here's the key about that. If we can somehow foster the correct unity despite those disagreements, that's great. But I will say this, we've said this several times, if something like mask, as silly as that seems, becomes a point where somebody is being divisive on the verge of splitting a congregation on that, as odd as it seems, if somebody doesn't stop, they could be disciplined over mask. Because division has to be dealt with.
And the clarity has to be there that it's not the mask.
Right. It's about division.
And to understand it, you think that there are certain individuals that Terry and I both know that have actual family members, and they themselves have legitimate health and physical issues with sensory issues with masks. I'm thinking about kids who have some unique genetic markers in their development, and sensory issues are a big deal for them. Work it out, and everyone knows, hey, look, that's going to be a challenge for them. How can we make it better for them is the response. Well, how can I make it better for my brother? How can I make it better for my sister?
That's what Chris Kramer's kind of comment. If we approach every conflict with the attitude to gain your brother on both sides, there would rarely be conflicts. Ironic. I mean, that's what Philippians 2, 3, and 4 says about all this. That's the interesting thing is, if we really practice putting Phil's interest above my interest, we'd all get along better, right? I mean, that's the idea of Philippians 2, 3, and 4. Often what's happening, not always, and I think one of the things about a legitimate complaint is that, maybe I'm not putting somebody else's needs ahead of my own. I think that's one of the things to understand. I could be the problem, and that's a big point to consider.
Well, and it happens in every single relationship. We learn how to deal with it early on in life. We should learn how to do it in our marriages. We should learn how to do it at work, and we should learn how to do it in our congregational families. Sometimes we don't learn at the same rate, but we're still learning how to deal with those things. And this has just given us opportunity to explore that challenge. And it's not going to change. Going forward next year, no matter what next year decides to dump out of the Pandora's box of possibilities, I guarantee you there'll be stuff that is uncomfortable for me, for Terry, for everybody. And we're going to have to figure out how to manage all of that in a healthy way. That, like, this is going to be okay. And here's why it's going to be okay, because we can worship God. We've learned some new things. The church has grown spiritually. Maybe it's grown numerically. And because of those, we're now better suited to do this new thing. And it's going to be okay. Like, that's sometimes I just want to go out and say, hey, everybody, chill out. It's going to be okay.
Yeah, I think one of the things about all the negativity that we've dealt with right now in this quarantine quarreling that's going on and all that stuff, and what we've dealt with the pandemic is we have been forced to realize some things that we didn't realize before. I think we appreciate our fellowship more than we did before all this happened. Going to church was some kind of routine for a lot of us. It was just a habit, right? And I use that as an illustration. And now it's something that we treasure. I mean, whether if we have to meet outside, we're just glad to be together. Like if we whatever it is, if we have to meet in smaller groups to be able to facilitate what we need to do, we're just happy that we can meet and be together. And I'm using that really as an illustration to say, even in dealing with criticism, even though it's hard to deal with all of that, so often you are better off at the end of all of that if you handle it the right way. You and the congregation can grow when criticism is handled correctly. And that applies if it's legitimate or not. If it's legitimate and it's handled correctly, you grow because you change what needs to be changed. If it's not legitimate, you can grow because you didn't give it legitimacy when it didn't deserve it. And you can talk about how to handle things going forward. In every aspect of this, if you handle it correctly, the church is better off in the end because you've handled it in a godly, correct way.
Right.
At the other side, if you don't, that's destructive.
And you can think about it even more simplified. We struggle because emotionally, and thinking about Shane's earlier comment about being a person who is a people pleaser, we want agreement
Yeah.
on the emotional level. But then also we are balancing between some other things, which is one, you've got criticism and complaint. We don't want complaint. We need criticism. We conflate the two ideas and say either all criticism is valid or all complaint is valid. And we suppress this idea of a design to have, well, I need agreement. We emotionally have now reprioritized the things that mattered. When God tells us that iron sharpens iron, men can sharpen men, the criticism has its place. Uh, Complaint is supposed to be dealt with. Like complaint is a different thing. And so separating those things out in the process of dealing with conflict in a congregation is going to really help in making things better. And the more effective we can be at that, I really think that congregations will grow stronger and healthier. And on a personal level, just think about it this way. Some of your sermons and some of my sermons are not going to be good. And they're going to be justifiably criticized. Even if we put in tons of work ahead of time, they just didn't end up as good as we wanted them to be. It's okay. And some of our best sermons will be the ones that get the most complaint. And that's okay too, because the complaints may be coming from someone who is dealing with the effect of a good sermon that pierced them, and now they're having to deal with it.
Yeah, it's funny. The sermons I think are always going to be bad end up being the ones people like the most. But I guess that's another podcast.
That's an entire mystery.
Yeah, I don't understand how that happens. Hal makes a great comment. Yeah, Hal makes a great comment. We need to wrap up. But he said, if my personal needs are not adequately addressed, that does not necessarily mean the body of Christ is on the wrong track. I think that's a great thing to remember. Just because I'm not getting my way, that doesn't mean the church is doing things wrong, right? And I think one of the things to add to that, by the way, for all of us is there's always more than one way to do things. And I think that, for me, I think I was raised in a very binary world, Phil, from the standpoint of I think I was raised believing there's only one way to do everything, and especially in the church. And I just want to say that's not always true. There's a lot of things we can do a lot of ways that still glorify God and edify one another. And just because it's not what you want or not what you are used to does not mean that it is wrong. And that's something to consider before you begin complaining.
Another way to reframe Terry's comments as we get to the close of our time: do you want to be effective or to just be? My perspective has shifted over the years to become really crystallized into I will do anything short of sin to share the gospel in any context. Understanding that I might have to submit myself to somebody else's perspective or position in order to accomplish that. And that means the thing that I want to do isn't the thing that we do.
Because I'll give up tacos? Would you give up tacos?
Absolutely, 100% today.
But it would be painful.
In the end, I think we're probably better. I probably could do it.
Yeah. No, we absolutely would. I'd even give up donuts.
Yep. Wait a minute. Hey, everybody, I want to appreciate all of your patience with us. Sometimes the technology functions exactly as it should, and I'm surprised my backup plan to let this automatically hop over to Terry functioned. And so it did all of its thing and seamlessly, apparently. So I'm less necessary every day. That's awesome.
Well, really let's just say that all those years of table topics and Toastmasters paid off while you poofed.
The power just said, I don't want to work right now. I don't want to adult today is what the power said at our house for a little bit. Yeah. So then it came back on. But we really appreciate you. If you've got questions about the work of evangelism, about the work of gospel preaching that we can somehow address in this format, let us know. We've got some more stuff planned for the upcoming years, some studies and opportunities that we're looking forward to in any of these areas. If we can be of service to you, let us know, and we'll be happy to have Terry solve them all. You guys take care. Have a great day. You got to shut it off now, Terry.
How do I shut it off?
It should say live somewhere. I don't know.